Hello, this is Andrew Thake from Minds and Money. Delighted to say that today we're joined by Warren Irwin, Chief Executive Officer and Chief Investment Officer of Rosseau Asset Management, one of the world's leading hedge funds, but also one of the leading natural resource investors over the last 20 years. Delighted to have you with us today, Warren.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew.
Great. Well, let's go and dive straight in with a favorite commodity of yours, uranium. What's behind the recent rise in the uranium price?
Well, over the past few years, there's been obviously a supply deficit of uranium, with production in the range of 180 million pounds a year, and demand and production around the 120, 130 range. So there has been a deficit that's been met up by secondary supply. So everybody in the market has known that sort of the secondary supply is gradually drying up. And also with respect to the cost structure of any new uranium mines coming online to fill in that gap, people are expecting, $60 to $70 uranium needed to start bringing new mines into production. So it's been in a bit of a gradual stealth uptrend for the last few years, up from about $17 to around the $30 range. And then recently, what's brought a lot of it to the fore has been the advent of Sprott uranium trusts, where basically they're able to raise money in the market and go into raise money from investors and go into the spot uranium market and start tidying up the spot market a little bit. The market has been a tiny bit sloppy, and what Sprott's been able to do is go in there and pick up some of these pounds that are floating around in the market and take it off market and put it in some vaults for a while. So that's helped tidy up the market, and it led to the rise from about $30 to over $50. It's backed off into the low 40s right now, but that's led to the tightening.
Do you think that's, that they're trying to corner the market?
It's not really up to Sprott to corner it. Basically, what they'll do is they're just sort of a conduit for investors. If investors keep throwing money at them, they basically take that money and put it into the market. So it's really not up to them to decide whether they're cornering the market or not. It's sort of not. It's not like the Hunt brothers, where they're intentionally trying to corner the silver market back in the 80s. Sprott just created a vehicle. The vehicle, when they raise money, they go into the market and buy uranium. So if the investing public wants to throw billions of dollars at Sprott, and they really have no choice but to take that and invest it in the market. And but I don't think there's any intentional mandate or desire by them to specifically corner the market. They're just a conduit for investors to get some exposure to actually the commodity uranium.
With this uranium price rise, we have been here before. Is this kind of the start of like a long-term trend?
My personal opinion, when people ask me about it, is we are in a long-term trend here, in my opinion, upwards for uranium. And the reason for it is on the demand side. I think more and more people are becoming have accepted the fact that we cannot power the world in the future with on fairy dust. And if you listen to politicians and environmentalists over the past number of years and some of the many decades, they somehow believe that we could power the world with wind and solar, which is clear, by the incidents in Texas, by what's gone on, the fiasco in Germany with solar, the fiasco with wind and solar in Texas. Like, it's clear that they were living in a fantasy, and they were being sold a bill of goods by the climate change people that wind and solar could power our future. And that's clearly not the case. We need stable baseload for our industry, for our cities, for days in which there's no wind, and for obviously evenings when there's no light. And in Canada's case, a lot of the winter we're cloud covered. So it's not realistic to power the world with wind and solar. And we basically need baseload power that's reliable, non-CO2 generating. And there's only two options from what I can tell. And it's either hydropower, and we've dammed up most of our rivers, and I'd hate to see any more dammed up, but there's probably a few left to be dammed up in the world. But nuclear power is the answer. And it generates reliable baseload electricity to power our electrical future. And So people have figured that out in places that are less political, like in China, they figured that one out, and they're building. They're right now in the biggest reactor build since the 1970s happened in the U.S. And so around the world, people are figuring it out. In the U.S., even they're extending the life of a number of reactors. So it's a good thing.
What about the safety concerns that some Greens sometimes raise? They say, well, what happens if there's another Fukushima? Can you basically explain, I guess, in layperson's terms, how these modular nuclear plants that are being built are kind of different and are safer?
Well, the new Gen 4s are safer. The ones I'm familiar with are molten salt reactors, which are Gen 4. And what's good about them is because they're already molten, they're already in liquid form, they're fail-safe. So you can't have a meltdown because your fuel is already melted down. And in order for the process to work, you need to keep power going to it. So if, for instance, if Fukushima happened and you knocked out your backup generators, well, it wouldn't matter because the process would just stop. And that's where the Gen 4 reactors are quite good. And with respect to the existing fleet of reactors, we're going to still have some residual danger, in my opinion, especially with some of these old Soviet-style reactors. And still, if they start doing, stupid tests and stupid simulations that led to the Chernobyl problem. But generally, I think the current light water reactors, they've been operating for half a century very safely. Nuclear power, despite what the Greenies tell, or the Greenies are, some Greenies are for it, some Greenies are against it. But the reality is, if you look at all the dams that have broken, all the people that have died from breathing in the fumes from thermal coal plants that generate power, nuclear energy by far is the safest form of baseload energy. So that's safety concerns, especially with the next generation modular fail-safe reactors. They've really stepped it up a notch. The other issue people have is with respect to nuclear waste, and the nuclear waste is in terms of I've heard a number of stats, and I haven't verified any of these, but basically I've read a number of articles where basically all the nuclear waste that's been generated in the entire world is could fit in a football field, 100 yards by however many yards, up 9 or 10 feet. And so that's not a lot of waste when you start thinking about, so basically, and there are a lot, because of a lot of environmental issues, a lot of that waste remains on site at the plants. But what people fail to realize, well, if you don't generate, and that waste is being dealt with, there's a number of different ways going forward that nuclear waste will be dealt with. Bill Gates is working on a reactor that will actually use nuclear waste as a fuel and take any remaining energy out of it. So that's just one option. There's a whole bunch of other options that make a ton of sense. And of course, the Greenies have been, or some Greenies have been blocking a number of common sense alternatives for nuclear waste. But what nobody's talking about is, let's say, thermal coal. When the amount of coal we burned in the last, let's say, 50 years since the Greenies got anti-nuke back in the 70s, have a lot of heavy metals in them, whether it be cadmium and all the other real nasties. And we've been burning so much coal over the past half century. Not only has it led to CO2 in the atmosphere and a lot of other nasties in the atmosphere, a lot of these heavy metals are left in the remains of the burned out coal. And we have to ask ourselves, where are all these heavy metals going? And not only the ones that are put into the air for people to breathe and causing premature death around the world. So it's extraordinarily dangerous to have all that waste around. And so I'm not as fussed about nuclear waste, because nuclear waste is well traced. It's looked after, and there's a number of options going forward that we could deal with it. And I have some ideas myself based on my experience in the mining business, and Bill Gates has some ideas. So there'll be some solutions to those issues.
Mm-hmm. One of Rosseau's significant investments is in next-gen energy. Can you just tell us briefly why you're excited about next-gen energy?
Well, we got involved in next-gen energy quite a long time ago. I was one of the first investors on the ground in northern Saskatchewan when they were just an early stage company just drilling holes. Over the past 5 or 6 years, it's been clear to, it was clear to us about 5 or 6 years ago, and that's why we were at one point the largest shareholder in NextGen at over 10%. But NextGen will be probably the most economic, well, it will be the most economic uranium mine in the world. It'll be very large. It'll generate between 20 and 30 million pounds of uranium a year, which will be a significant part of the market, and it's quite economic. And if you work the economics out for NextGen's project, it's probably one of the most economic mining projects of any commodity in the entire world. And it's in one of the top mining jurisdictions in the world, which is Saskatchewan, a province in Western Canada. So it's an extraordinary deposit, and I'm a huge fan of it. And we've been a huge fan of it for 5 or 6 years, and we still own a fair number of shares in it.
So if I was a mining CEO at an up-and-coming uranium junior, and I hadn't been around during the last uranium cycle, what advice would you give to me for this uranium cycle? What lessons should I learn from the last uranium cycle?
Well, yeah, well, you never know whether this one's going to play out the way the last one did. The one observation, both for the CEOs and for investors to watch here, is during the last cycle, there's some, I've read some numbers where there are as many as 500 or 600 uranium juniors created in the last cycle when uranium spiked well north of $100 per pound. The concern, I would think, in this cycle, for me anyways, is how long will the cycle last? Because if you're a CEO of a junior uranium company, it's really a grassroots situation where you're just doing preliminary geophysics before you even start drilling your project. It will be many, many years before you're able to drill out an economic deposit, let alone put it into production. And during that drill out stage, you need a good market. You need investors interested in your commodity. And the biggest risk any of these juniors run, and hence there'll be the risk too the investors are taking, is that if this uranium cycle gets carried away and gets overheated too quickly, too fast, and ends too quickly, those guys are 1 or 2 years into their exploration program, and then boom, there's no interest in uranium anymore. They'll have a tough time funding their programs going forward. So that is probably the biggest risk. So if I was a CEO, or the best advice I would give to a CEO is take a look at your runway. If you need funds over the next 3 years, and you have a frothy market here for uranium, and you're able to raise a whole bunch of money now to fund your program for the next number of years, I would recommend you take the money and spend it very, very wisely, and make sure it lasts you as long as you can, and get on with that discovery. But the worst thing you could do is think, well, we're going to raise a little bit now and a little bit next year and a little bit the year after, because you never know whether the financing window will be open next year or the year after. So I'd take the money. It's probably the quickest piece of advice I would give them.
One of the big sort of trends over the last 18 months has been the whole decarbonization trend within mining, and obviously investing in uranium is obviously one sort of part of that. But of course, there's also many sort of pundits think that one should go and invest into battery metals. So apart from investing into uranium, investing into companies like NextGen Energy, should I be investing into traditional battery metals like lithium and cobalt?
Okay, I have a very different view on battery metals than anybody else. And, obviously it annoys some people, but my view is very simple. When I look at the electrification of the world with EVs, there's a number of things I can control. There's things I cannot control. For sure, we're going to need copper, right? So we're going to need copper for EVs. That's a given. I love copper. I invest in copper. So that's what I've done. And then with respect to, well, you're going to need clean power to power those EVs. Well, the only clean power on scale left, in my opinion, is uranium. So that's why I'm a big fan of both copper and uranium. When people ask me about battery metals, I take a look at the current configuration, and people are using right now, let's say the key metals people talk about are cobalt, nickel, and lithium. And lithium's, not necessarily a metal, but it's an element used in batteries. So the concern I have with cobalt and nickel is a fantastic metal, and I will be investing in it, but not for anything related to EVs. Cobalt, is a big problem child, in my opinion. And the reason is that I think every battery engineer in the entire world is trying to engineer out cobalt. The numbers I've looked at, and I've dealt with the DRC and the Democratic Republic of Congo. I've been to the DRC. I've dealt with the DRC. I know the DRC reasonably well. It's the source of the world's, about 80% of the world's cobalt. There's no way we could bet our energy or EV future on a country like the DRC. So that's why every engineer is trying to engineer out cobalt. It's too expensive, and they want to get a commodity. They want to get an element in the new battery technologies that is not as expensive, because that's probably the key to widespread adoption of EVs, is to get the cost of the batteries down and get the lifespan and the cycle times lower. So everybody's trying to engineer out cobalt, and I think the next one they're trying to engineer out is nickel. So I love nickel. It's a fantastic commodity, but I'm investing in it, but it's not for the EV kick, frankly. And because I believe nickel is gradually being engineered out also. Lithium, I do not believe is being engineered out, because it's already very, very plentiful in the world. There's lots of it. We were not going to run into a shortage of it. There's a lot of new technologies that are being developed right now, which will open up a lot of new frontier lithium plays. So I'm not worried about lithium. I've got one small early stage lithium investment I'm working on right now, but there's lots of lithium. So that's why I believe lithium will remain stable for the battery technologies. But as far as nickel and cobalt, I think they're too rare, they're too expensive. And I think they'll gradually be engineered out over time for and replaced by cheaper elements.
Just a follow-up question. You've used the phrase "engineer out" a few times. By that, do you mean changing the composition of lithium-ion batteries and just changing the sort of the mix and the amount of cobalt and nickel you have within the lithium-ion batteries?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, either reduce their usage or eliminate them altogether. There are technologies out there with various pluses and minuses that do not use cobalt or nickel, and it's just a matter of someday some guy in his backyard, in his garage, is going to come up with some idea that you're going to be able to use some elements that are super cheap, and that'll be a real turning point, I think, for EVs, is when we find a super cheap battery.
Yeah, a lot of investors I talk to say, well, actually, one area that I am looking at is the whole rare earths area. Are you a fan of rare earths?
Well, once again, I have a different view of rare earths than everybody else in the world. I think I think China did themselves a great disservice by sort of restricting the supply of rare earths to the Western world for a period of time there. It kind of reminds me of when Russia shut down natural gas to Europe for a while, just to show their strength. What happens is the consumers will start looking for alternate sources. Now, the reason why it's difficult for, let's say, a North American rare earths miner to make money is because we have to deal with first world environmental standards. And in China, with respect to not only extraction, but refining of these rare earths, it can be environmentally messy. And the restrictions in China are less onerous than they are in the Western world. So it's very difficult to compete, especially when your buyers are going, well, this rare earth is an element, we'll buy it as cheaply as we can, and we don't worry about the environmental footprint it has. And that's sort of the world we're in right now. But for that to change, we need to have users of rare earths concerned about the source of it and the environmental footprint of the mining and refining process that's taking place. Because China is the biggest producer of rare earths, but by no means do they have a monopoly on rare earths. There's rare earths everywhere. And we can mine them and make money on them, but the problem is we need to be put in a stable on an equal footing with China, and right now we're not. We're at a huge disadvantage with respect to environmental costs of both mining and refining. So that's why everything's being done in China.
We've talked a little bit about some investments that Rosseau asset management have made. At what stage do you like to come in as an investor?
My favorite time to come in is just after 2 or 3 years into a junior, having done 2 or 3 years worth of grassroots exploration, and is starting to show signs of promise and have possibly made their initial discovery, and people are not aware of it. So what we do in our forte is when we pick up a sense that somebody might be onto a new discovery, we jump in a plane, we go visit the site, we try and determine for ourselves whether or not it has legs to turn into something big. That's exactly what we did with both two of our biggest holdings right now, some of our biggest holdings. NextGen is exactly what happened there. I got wind of a discovery, jumped in a plane, went up there, checked it out. I thought it was going to be huge, and fortunately, I was right on that one. The other time too was down in a big copper discovery in Ecuador called Cascabel. It was owned by SolGold. It's owned by SolGold, and same story there. As soon as I heard they pulled a nice big hole. I forget the exact metrics of it, but it was well over 1.5 kilometers of highly mineralized core, which is extraordinary. So I jumped on a plane, went down there, spent a few nights in the jungle, and I got a sense that they were on something really, really big. So those are two examples of how we like to get involved.
You could have talked in the answer to your previous question. You said you used the phrase jumped. You used the phrase jumped on a plane. Obviously, one of the last challenges of the last 18 months, you haven't been able to jump on a plane, or not for like large sort of like lengths of time. So how do you make investments? How have you made investments over the last 18 months when you haven't been able to travel? And I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that usually before you make an investment, you like to have prior knowledge of the management team. You like to like met them face to face and stare them into the eyes, stare them into the white of their eyes, or have done like a site visit. Have you managed to carry on business over the last 18 months?
Yeah, I haven't done quite as much overseas or in South America, but what I have done is I've managed to jump in my pickup truck and drive to Nevada and go up into the mountains and visit a gold project.
Wow.
I've also driven to Merritt, British Columbia, not far from where I have a home, and check out a copper project. I've also checked up on a gold project up in northern BC. So those are three I could think of off the top of my head. Yeah, so I've just been basically jumping in my pickup truck and going for a drive. So. And in one instance, driving from Canada to Nevada is a bit of a hike, but it was worth it. It was worth it. So,
does that actually mean that you only invest in like North America, or that you're only currently looking at investments in North America due to the travel restrictions?
right now, I think travel is opening up. I have a tremendous mineral situation in Africa that I'm in the process now of scheduling a trip over to see. So yeah, by no means am I giving up. The world is our oyster here, and we've got tremendous things going on around the world. There's good jurisdictions, there are bad jurisdictions, and sometimes good jurisdictions are turning into bad jurisdictions, and sometimes the other way around. So we're open around the world to new and interesting new discoveries. For instance, in Ecuador, we watched Ecuador going from a good, going through the cycle, a good place to invest, a really bad place to invest, and now they're back to being a good place to invest. And yeah.
But I mean, how do you sort of like manage that? Because with sort of like Canada, I know obviously you do get changes in like kind of government, but by and large, you kind of know what you're going to get with Canada. But with Latin America and with Africa, you can go from having a quite right-wing government to quite a socialist government that becomes quite anti-mining. How do you kind of manage and mitigate that political risk?
Yeah, well, in the instance of let's say Ecuador, I was one of the largest shareholders in Irwin, and which made the Fruta del Norte gold discovery down there. And as we noticed that the lefties were coming in, we're going, man, we got to get this thing sold. So we sold it, and the lefties were in for a while. They were anti-mining, and or not anti-mining necessarily, as they wanted all the economics out of the mine, so nobody put it into production. And then sure enough, Lucas Lundin stepped up, and Lundin Gold bought it, and just as the tides were turning, and he's managed to turn it into a real gem. So there are cycles, and it's certainly funny, because what happens generally is in a lot of countries like that, they go through the cycles. they have no mining. There's nothing. Their mining industry is in the gutter. And then they create a positive mining environment. So they get guys like myself and others to invest and go in there, find some new, really good properties, make some discoveries, and we're trying to put things into production and get the mining industry going. And then they get greedy, and then they start creating these draconian laws against mining about massive royalty payments and things like that. And then all of a sudden, mines don't get built. Then next 10 years, there's nothing going on in mining again. So it's a cycle. And the guys that do very, very well, mining is not like, let's say, oil and gas, where you can drill a hole and put a pipe in and suck the oil out right away. We're looking at, in some instances, 5 to 10 years to get a mine permitted and built. It's a long-term capital investment. And that's why I think you'll find that miners are not as risk tolerant as oil and gas people, because the timelines are so long. We need some level of stability, because by the time, if it takes you 8 years to permit and build the mine, well, and you get a 3-year payback, well, it's 11 years out and before you start actually making a return on your capital. So it is important to have a reasonably stable jurisdiction for sure.
Okay, well, I think we're just out of sort of time. So all that remains for me to do is to go and thank Warren Irwin, Rosseau Asset Management, for a really fantastic and insightful interview. Thank you very much, Warren.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Great chatting with you. Cheers.